Woo! AKA Papa Hemingway, Ernest Miller Hemingway, born July 21st, 1899 in Oak Park, Illinois. Well, now it's Oak Park. It used to be called something different, but now it's called Oak Park, Illinois. His parents were Dr. Clarence Hemingway, he was a physician, and Grace Hemingway, and she was a musician. That was his mom. He was the second born of 6 kids. He was the only boy. His dad was like super interested in like literature and history, and he was a real outdoorsy guy too. He liked, to go like big game hunting and fishing and all that great stuff. Okay, so I found this somewhere, and I found it on IMDb, and I wanted to fact check it before I mentioned it, and then I found it mentioned briefly in one of the books that I read, and then I found a picture of Ernest Hemingway as a child. Oh, P.S. Here's baby Hemingway. How cute is he? So apparently, this is what I found out. So apparently his mom was like a domineering type, and she never wanted a son. She wanted all girls. So when Ernest, from the time he was born until he was about 4, she used to dress him up as a girl and called him Ernestine. And so found it on IMDb, I fact checked it, found it in a book that I picked up at the library, and then I found this picture of Ernest when he was like, I don't know, it's from 1901, so he was 2. That looks like a dress, you guys. Like complete with a frilly hat and all. Who does that? Anyway, that was news to me. So I thought I would mention it. Okay, so he graduated from high school in 1916 and started writing for the Kansas City Star, and that's where he had like came up with his minimalistic style. Is I think what they call it. Yeah, minimalist style. And he pretty much just adopted the Star's guide. It was use short sentences, use short first paragraphs, vigorous English, be positive, not negative. We actually saw that a lot in The Big Two-Hearted River, parts 1 and 2. So 6 months later, he joined the ambulance corps in World War I. He actually wanted to enlist in the army, but he had terrible eyesight, so they wouldn't let him. So he opted to be an ambulance driver, and he served as an ambulance driver in the Italian front. And he was wounded by, what was it? I think he was a mortar shell, and that left like 200 some odd shrapnels in both of his legs. But what's so cool is that he like refused anybody like to help. He refused for anybody to help him to safety. He was going back to where all the action was, like, and taking Italian soldiers to safety and helping them out from the same attack. So I just thought that was super cool. He got the silver medal. Yes, he required He required several surgeries. Yeah, and he got the silver medal for bravery for that. So while he was kind of recovering from that, he met a woman. It was a nurse that he met called Agnes Van Kurowski. And he fell in love with her, and they asked her to marry him, and she said yes, but she ended up leaving him for another man. And that kind of set the tone for his relationship with women in general, as you'll see. He married 4 times, and each time, he would get married, and then shortly, a couple, 2-3 years after, he would meet another, usually younger woman, and then fall in love with her and start having an affair, and then he would get divorced and then marry the one he was having an affair with, and it just kind of kept happening. So I just kind of thought that was interesting. So in 1921, he moved to Paris with his first wife, Hadley Richardson, and that's where he continued his writing career as a reporter for the Toronto Star. And it was also there where he published his first 2 books, 3 Stories and 10 Poems, and In Our Time, which Big Two-Hearted River is from In Our Time. They weren't so much novels, they were more of a collection of short stories. The first one's kind of obvious, 3 Stories and 10 Poems. But anyway, so he met Gertrude Stein in Paris, and she introduced him to a whole bunch of like writers and artists and composers, and it was like his kind of introduction. He became part of the lost generation, as Gertrude Stein called it. He actually references the lost generation in The Sun Also Rises? Or is it Farewell to Harmony? The Sun Also Rises. I think he refers to it like the preface. So, okay, so the Lost Generation, that's part of the literary movement that he was a part of. So basically the Lost Generation was anyone who came of age during or shortly after World War One. And it was mostly composed of like writers, artists, composers, anyone who was coming of age during or shortly thereafter World War One was considered to be part of the Lost Generation. And Lost didn't, from what I read on it briefly, Lost didn't necessarily mean what you would think it means. It meant more like disoriented. Yeah, it's just kind of, yeah, okay. So, I mean, the war had just ended. Okay. Some of the other artists and writers, again, trying not to ramble, some of the other writers and artists that were part of the Lost Generation are like T.S. Eliot, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Henry Miller, William Faulkner? Yeah, William Faulkner, Steinbeck, Sherwood Anderson, most of the people that were reading in this class, to be perfectly honest. Okay, so Gertrude Stein was his mentor, but he eventually kind of withdrew from her, and I guess their relationship just kind of started deteriorating until they had like a literary like squabble that spanned, I mean, it lasted for years. I don't know why, but I mean, they, whatever. And then he met Ezra Pound in 1922 by chance, and they became close. They toured Italy together in 1923. They lived on the same street in 1924. And Ezra Pound kind of recognized him as a young talent and took him under his wing. He introduced Hemingway to the Irish writer James Joyce, who we will obviously not be reading because he's Irish. And Hemingway and James Joyce, I guess, would go on many alcoholic adventures together. So they became close as well. Okay, hold on. Kind of jump here. Bam! Okay. So then in 1927, he divorced his wife, and Hadley Richardson, and married Pauline Pfeiffer, whom he had already been having an affair with, because that's just what he did. And he had one son with Hadley Richardson named Jack, nicknamed Bumpy. Bumby? Bumby. B-U-M-B-Y. Bumby. And then he had 2 more sons with Pauline, Patrick, and Gregory, which, fun fact about Gregory Hemingway. So, this kid apparently had, like, issues with his sexual identity his entire life, and eventually he had gender reassignment surgery, and thus was known as Gloria Hemingway. True story. Look it up. It's for real. Okay, blah, 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 blah. Okay, yeah. So while they were still living in Paris, he and Pauline, Hemingway suffered a severe head injury when he pulled a skylight down on his head. thought he was pulling on a toilet chain, but no. And it actually left him with a serious, oh man, I forgot to show these pictures. Okay, look. So this is him in his little army getup. It's another picture of him when he was younger. Okay. Okay, yeah, so the scar. It actually left him with like a super gnarly scar, like right on his forehead. This is a really small picture. You might not be able to see it, actually. It's like right there. Well, whatever. I'm bringing these pictures in with me, and I should be sitting there because I was sick a couple days ago, but I'm fine now. There's no reason for me not to go in tomorrow. No reason at all. So I should be sitting like right there-ish. And what I'll do is I'll just pass out the pictures, which I probably already did, so you're probably laughing. All right, whatever. Anyway, moving right along. So, he and Pauline, like after a while, after a couple years, like she wanted to leave Paris. She wanted to go back to America. And a friend of theirs, I'm blanking on his name right now, Von Doss. I'm blanking on his name right now, and I want to, not take an hour to do this. Okay, so she wanted to go back to America. A friend of theirs suggested Key West, so they moved to Key West. Moved to Key West, and that's where Hemingway resided mostly in the 1930s. Okay. In 1933, Hemingway and Pauline went on safari to East Africa, and that trip provided material for like the green hills of Africa, the snows of Kilimanjaro. Why didn't I write this down? The snows of Kilimanjaro. There was another story that he... Okay, well, The Short and Happy Life of Francis McCumber. Okay. So, yeah, he bought a boat in 1934, named it the Pilar, and he kind of used it to sail the Caribbean. He was really outdoorsy. Like, he liked to go on African safaris. He used to do it all the time. There's tons of pictures of him holding up, like, his catch, and I don't feel comfortable with that, so I'm not going to do that. Like, I'm not going to show you those pictures, but you can definitely look it up. If you, like, Google Hemingway and look in images, like, you'll see pictures of him holding up marlins and with lions and, like, cheetahs, and he was kind of a badass. So, where was I? Okay, so in 1936, he met Martha Gellhorn. She was a journalist. Can anybody guess what happened with he and Martha? I'll give you a hint. She was wife number 3. He was still married to Pauline, by the way, when he met her. And he asked her to marry him, like, 3 dates in. The 3rd time they met, he literally was like, will you marry me? Weirdo. I love him, but weirdo. Okay, so this is really cool. In 1937, Hemingway agreed to report on the Spanish Civil War for the North American Newspaper Alliance. He arrived in Spain in March. Dos Passos, that was the guy's name. Okay, he arrived in Spain in March. Martha joined him shortly thereafter. And then later in 1937, while in Madrid with Martha, he wrote his only play, The Fifth Column, as the city was bombarded. Returned to Key West for a few months, and then he went back to Spain twice in 1938, where he was present at the Battle of the Ebro, the last Republican stand. He was among the British and American journalists who were some of the last to leave the battle as they crossed the river. Here's another fun fact. He was also present at the Normandy landings and the liberation of Paris. Super awesome. Like, he was there. He was there. That's crazy. Okay. In the spring of 1939, he went to Cuba. Martha joined him soon after, and she and Hemingway were married after his divorce from Pauline was finalized. Already said that. In May 1944 to 1945, he went to London, and that's where he met Mary Welsh. Oh no, Mary Welsh. Mary Welsh is the one that he proposed to on their 3rd date. That's annoying. Okay. Jeez, man. Why didn't I just write it all in one place? Okay, in 1947, he was awarded a Bronze Star for his bravery during World War II. That was, I'm assuming, for being present at the Normandy landings. He wasn't first in. I guess that's a myth that he was like first in at the Normandy landings. He was a safe distance away, but he could see everything. And there's I don't remember if it's an article that he wrote or if it's in one of his short stories, but he describes like the arrival of the first troops that came up on the beach. I mean, that's super, super cool. Okay. Got the Bronze Star. He was recognized for his valor, having been under fire in combat areas in order to obtain an accurate picture of the conditions. And with that commendation, with the commendation that through his talent of expression, Mr. Hemingway enabled readers to obtain a vivid picture of the difficulties and triumphs of the frontline soldier and his organization in combat. And that quote is from Ernest Hemingway, A Life Story. No. Yeah, Ernest Hemingway, A Life Story. Ernest Hemingway, A Life Story by Carlos Baker. Yeah, that I'm remembering that right. Yeah, okay. So in 1946, he married Mary. He had gotten divorced to Martha, or from Martha, and had married Mary. Sounds funny. Okay, and she got pregnant too, but she had what's called an ectopic pregnancy. And what that is it's basically when you get pregnant in your fallopian tube as opposed to your uterus. It's actually very dangerous, and if it's not caught right away, it could leave you infertile, and you could actually die. So it's not a good time, needless to say. Okay, the Hemingway family suffered a series of accidents and health problems in the years following the war. In 1945, Hemingway smashed his knee and got another deep wound on his forehead. He got hurt a lot. I mean, he was in a lot of physical pain. He was in a lot of physical pain from the shrapnels, you know, when he was in the Italian front, from that wound that he sustained. But then he kept getting hurt. Like he took a skylight to the forehead. He got into a car accident. He smashed his knee. He was in 2 plane crashes 2 days apart. He got burned in a brush fire. Like, this kid, dear Lord. Okay. Just saying. Okay, so he started to sink into depression as his friends started to die. So like Scott Fitzgerald in 1940, Sherwood Anderson, and James Joyce in 1941, Gertrude Stein, because eventually he and Gertrude like patched things up, in 1946, Max Perkins in 47. Max Perkins was Hemingway's like Scribner's editor and friend, and Scribner was the name of the publishing company. Oh, another fun fact. So, The Sun Also Rises, F. Scott Fitzgerald, I guess, somehow got his hands on the manuscript. I don't know, I'm trying to remember if Hemingway gave it to him, like, to read, or I think that was it. He gave it to him to read. And F. Scott Fitzgerald was the one who called his publishing company and said, hey, listen, this kid like just wrote an amazing novel, you ought to take a look at it. And they did. And The Sun Also Rises kind of set the tone for Hemingway's career, because everybody was going nuts over it. Just was. Okay. So all his friends were dying, and during this period he like suffered from like headaches and high blood pressure, weight problems. He eventually had diabetes. He once contracted anthrax, true story. He got amoebic dysentery. His intestines, like, I think collapsed, and not a good time. Not a good time. Okay, I'm gonna skip through some of this because I want to kind of wrap up the bio. And he was a heavy drinker. So a lot of it, like some of it I think was genetic, But he was a heavy drinker, so I think a lot of it had to do with that too. Oh, okay, well this is worth mentioning. In 1948, Hemingway and Mary traveled to Europe and they stayed in Venice for several months, and while there, Hemingway fell in love with 19-year-old Adriana Ivancic. Okay, so she's 19, Adriana, and it's 1948. He was born in 1899. He would have been 1 in 1900, so he was 49 years old, and she was 19. I don't get it. Well, anyway, their platonic love affair inspired the novel Across the River and Into the Trees, which did not get good reviews. P.S. It was published in 1950, and it did not get good reviews at all. And the following year, he was pretty pissed that Across the River and Into the Seas did not get positive critical reception. So he started writing the draft of The Old Man and the Sea. And he wrote that draft in 8 weeks. And said, where is it? He said, it was the best I can ever write for all of my life. Yeah. Okay. Oh, here we go. I mentioned this already, but in 1954, while in Africa on safari, Hemingway was almost fatally injured in 2 successive plane crashes. He had chartered a sightseeing flight over the Belgian Congo as a Christmas present to Mary, so she was on the flight too. She didn't die, but she didn't die either. And on their way to photograph Murchison Falls from the air, the plane struck an abandoned utility pole and crash-landed in heavy brush. Hemingway's injuries included a head wound, while Mary broke 2 ribs. The next day, attempting to reach medical care in Entebbe, I don't know if I pronounced that right, Entebbe, they boarded a second plane that exploded at takeoff. He suffered burns and another concussion. And that one was serious enough to cause leaking of cerebral fluid. And funnily enough, after that second crash, like he and Mary were in the hospital recuperating or whatever, and he spent most of the time that he was recuperating, he spent reading his own obituaries. Even though he had told the press, hey, I'm good, I'm over here, I'm, not doing anything right now because it was kind of in a plane crash, but I'm not dead. Okay, so in 1954, he got the Nobel Prize. He actually won the Pulitzer Prize as well. He won the Pulitzer Prize for The Old Man and the Sea. Why am I blanking on what he won the Nobel Prize for? Was it the same one, The Old Man and the Sea? That's probably his most popular novel. And fun fact, that was the first Hemingway novel that I ever read. Ironically, I didn't know what I was reading when I picked it up. I had no idea what it was. I had heard of Ernest Hemingway, but I had never read anything of his. But I had to do a project for school, and to be perfectly honest, it was the smallest book in my mom's bookshelf, so just went ahead and picked it up, and I'm glad that I did, because I loved it. It sparked my literary love affair with Mr. Ernest Hemingway. Okay, so we're nearing the end here, guys. In November 1956, while in Paris, he was reminded of trunks he had stored in the Ritz Hotel in 1928 and never retrieved. And when he went back to reclaim and open the trunks, he discovered that the trunks were filled with notebooks and writings from his Paris years. So he was so stoked that when he went back to Cuba, because, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that. Okay, so he lived in Key West for most of the 30s. Then for most of the 40s and like the early 50s, he resided mainly in Cuba. He would go back and forth a lot between Key West and Cuba. Like he kept the Key West house until he died. But he resided mainly in Cuba. So when he went back to Cuba with all these like notes and journals and yada yada, he started writing A Movable Feast, which was his memoir from his years in Paris. Okay, blah, 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 blah. Okay, he finished A Movable Feast, which was scheduled to be released the following year, but it wasn't. Then he brought True at First Light, that's another one of his stories, to 200,000 words, and he added chapters to the Garden of Eden, another one of his works. And he worked on Islands in the Stream, again, another one of his stories. And the last three, so True at First Light, the Garden of Eden, and Islands in the Stream, they were stored in a safety deposit box in Havana and never to be retrieved again. And then he finished, like the finishing touches on A Movable Feast. Does this really matter? Yeah, kind of. It's history. Okay, so he was in Cuba in November 1959, between returning from Pamplona and traveling west to Idaho, where he eventually also resided in Ketchum, Idaho. And the following year for his birthday, but that doesn't matter. Okay, so that year he and Mary decided to leave Cuba after hearing the news that Castro wanted to nationalize property owned by Americans and other foreign nationals. So in July of 1960, the Hemingways left Cuba for the last time. Also, all of their art and all of Ernest Hemingway's manuscripts in that bank deposit box. They found like thousands of books after he died, and they got the box finally. They found thousands of books in there. Okay. So here's where it gets really grim. So in 1960, he went on a trip to Spain to be photographed for Life magazine. He had written a story for them. I think that it was a short story, but it was to be published in installments. And he went to be photographed. They were going to put him on the front cover. And Mary got wind from the press that he was really, really sick, and that he was dying. So she got really freaked out. And he sent her a telegram, and I have the quoted telegram here. And it said, "Reports false en route Madrid. Love, Papa." Papa was his nickname. I want to say that Mary was the one that gave him that nickname, but I'm not 100% sure. But I'm almost positive Mary was the one who gave him the nickname Papa. But he was lonely, and he took to his bed for days, despite having the first installments of The Dangerous Summer published in Life that September, and it actually got really good reviews. The Dangerous Summer, that was the story he was writing for Life magazine. So he left Spain. He went to New York, where Mary had an apartment, and he locked himself in the apartment, refused to leave, because he was convinced that he was being watched. He was super paranoid. And ironically enough, in the 1950s, I believe, the FBI had opened up a file on him. They had, because they thought he was doing some kind of something bordering the patrols of Cuba, anyway. He was constantly worried about his money, his safety. He worried about his taxes, and that he would never be able to go back to Cuba to retrieve the manuscripts that he had left there, which he never did. His family did eventually, but he never got to. He thought that the FBI was monitoring his movements in Ketchum, Idaho, and that's where... Because I guess, when he refused to leave Mary's apartment, she called his doctor and said, "Listen, you got to get him out of there and just bring him home," because they were residing in Ketchum, Idaho. So he brought Ernest Hemingway to their home in Ketchum, Idaho. They had opened up a file on him during World War II. Yeah, he used the Pilar, that was his boat, to patrol the waters of Cuba. Okay. And J. Edgar Hoover, I forgot I wrote that down, had an agent in Havana watching Hemingway during the 1950s. Okay, so fast forward. By the end of November, Mary was like at her wit's end. Like she couldn't do it by herself anymore. So she had the doctor come over, and the doctor said, okay, look, we should take him to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. So they did that. And it was under the assumption that he was being treated for hypertension, which was complete bullshit. He was really being treated for, like, you know, depression and paranoia. But they treated him with electroshock therapy. He was treated with electroshock therapy probably about 15 times, maybe even more. And I mean, as you can imagine, that probably rattled his brain pretty badly. He was released in January of 1961, and he went back to their home in Ketchum, Idaho. 3 months later, Mary came into the kitchen and found him in there holding a shotgun. Freaked out, called the doctor, and the doctor said, okay, well, let's sedate him. So he sedated him. They admitted him to, I think, the hospital at Sun Valley, and then shipped his ass back to the Mayo Clinic to get more electroshock therapy, by the way, just in case you were wondering, because you know the first time worked out so well. So he was released in late June, and he got home. He got home on June 30th, and then, sorry, it's just so sad. Okay, so then on July 2nd, in like the really early mornings, Ernest Hemingway went into his basement where he kept all his shotguns. He grabbed his favorite shotgun, and then he went upstairs. He went into the foyer. He put the shotgun in his mouth, and he pulled the trigger. Mary found him the next day. And for a while, the press was under... They told the press that it was accidental, even though they knew that it was self-inflicted. You know, I guess they wanted to... I guess they just wanted to preserve his, you know, his dignity and his integrity. They didn't want people to judge him. I mean, I can understand that, I guess. It's just so sad, you know? It's just so damn sad. And to think that this guy had been through all that he had been through, I mean, he had been in 2 wars. 3 wars, really, if you count the liberation of Paris. And 4 wars, if you count the Spanish Civil War. He had been through wars. He used to go, you know, big game fishing. He'd survived 2 plane crashes. He took a skylight to the forehead, and he survived it all. He saw it all. And yet he died by his own hand. It wasn't even something crazy that killed him. So 5 years after he died, Mary finally admitted that it was in fact self-inflicted, and he is now buried in Ketchum, Idaho. There are a number of memorials to him. There's obviously the Key West house in Key West, his residence. I'm trying to remember. Mary? One of his wives, I'm pretty sure it was Mary, it might have been Martha though, but one of his wives lived there for a few years after he died, and then she sold the house at a silent auction. I think the woman who bought it, her name was Bernice. I can't remember her last name, but her name was Bernice. She bought it for $80,000, and this is a huge house. Like, Google it sometime. This is a huge house. She bought it for 80 grand. And then she lived in there as her primary residence for a couple of years, but then she moved into the guest quarters, which actually is now the bookstore of the museum, and she was the one who opened up the main house for people to come in, and she kind of saw it as a memorial to, you know, and a tribute to Ernest Hemingway. Okay, so moving on. How long have I been yapping? That's pretty bad. Okay, we're gonna speed through this. All right. So I already discussed literary influences, Gertrude Stein. I already discussed his movements, so we've got that out of the way. I've mentioned a few of his works, but what the hell? I'll mention a couple more. You've got The Old Man and the Sea, already said it. A Farewell to Arms. If you've never read Ernest Hemingway, this is a long book, but it is so worth the read. It is my favorite novel of his. Amazing. A Clean, Well-Lighted Place is my favorite short story by him. It's actually been named, it's been referred to as one of the greatest short stories ever written. I agree. Okay, moving on. So let's do some quotes. We ate well and cheaply. We drank well and cheaply. We slept well and warm and loved each other. That's from A Movable Feast. I drink to make other people more interesting. A lot of you may have heard that before. That is an Ernest Hemingway quote. Okay, fight or die, that's what people do. They don't marry. That's also from A Farewell to Arms. Okay. All books are alike in that they are truer than if they had really happened, and after you are finished reading one, you will feel that all of that happened to you, and afterwards it all belongs to you. The good and the bad, the ecstasy, the remorse and sorrow, the people and places, and how the weather was. And this last quote, did I have one more? No, I didn't, because we need to move on. Okay, this last quote is from an interview that he did with George Plimpton. And he was asked about the function of his art. From things that have happened, and from things as they exist, and from all things that you know and all those you cannot know, you make something through your invention that is not a representation but a whole new thing, truer than anything true and alive, and you make it alive. And if you make it well enough, you give it immortality. I mean, if that didn't give you chills, just get up and leave right now. I'm just saying. Okay, analysis of the work. Okay, so Big Two-Hearted River, yay! First of all, I loved this story. I love a good fishing story. My dad used to take us fishing when we were kids all the time, so I related on that level to him. So, yeah, okay, I'm on track. Okay, so I just wanted to talk about, like, kind of touch on Nick's perception of the world from the very beginning when he's seeing, like, this city that's completely burnt down, and he's focusing on, you know, like, just everything around him that's burned. But immediately he gravitates towards everything that's alive, you know, the trouts and the rivers. And I mean, this story, I kept remembering the little factoid about how he basically followed the what was it? What's the word? The stars, the guide of the Kansas City Star. At the very tail end, the last guide or the last point is be positive, don't be negative. And that's what I feel he did in this story. Even though the city is burnt down, and even though he's tired and he's hungry, he's just gonna keep going, and he keeps looking up, and he keeps seeing these mountain or these hills, and the river over to the side, and the swamps, and the trout, and the grasshoppers are black. Why are they black? Oh, it must have been from the fire. But look, they're still jumping and they're still flying. And even when Nick, this mostly happens in part 2, but even when Nick starts fishing and he keeps coming through little tiny bumps in the road, for example, he starts gathering some grasshoppers at the very beginning, and he's trying to get them before the sun comes up for too long and dries them all up, because then they're going to be jumping, and then he's not going to be able, he's going to spend the whole day catching grasshoppers, and then he's going to be like, well, great, what am I going to do with all these grasshoppers? Nothing. So he's like trying to get all these wet grasshoppers, and a couple of them jump out, and he's like, no problem. So he gets a couple more, and then he puts a little, little stem there so that they can breathe still, but they won't come out. And then when he goes fishing, he tries to put one grasshopper on the hook, but whoop, jumps out right into the river, and off he goes. Oh, and there's a trout, came up and got him. And then he tries again, and he, even though he was getting down, like especially when he got that first big trout that he couldn't reel in. Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Well, okay, I'll talk about it while I look for it. When he get that big trout that he can't reel in, yeah, here it is. Okay, and he's like the line snaps, and he's like, man, now I'm totally bummed out. What am I gonna do? So he goes and he sits down and he has a cigarette. He gives himself kind of a woo-saw moment, if you would. And that's especially when he starts to not dwell in the negative, the fact that he didn't catch the trout. It's a river. There's other trout, probably just as big, if not bigger. And he does catch 2 big trout in the end, but here I'll quote a passage from here. His mouth dry, his heart down, Nick reeled in. He had never seen so big a trout. There was a heaviness, a power not to be held, and then the bulk of him as he jumped. He looked as broad as a salmon. Nick's hand was shaky, blah, blah, blah. Okay, basically he's marveling at the size of this trout and the power that this trout had. So Nick climbed out onto the meadow and stood, water running down his trousers and out of his shoes squelchy. He went over and sat on the logs. He did not want to rush his sensations any. He's going to sit on this log, and then he's taking a moment to kind of get himself out of this temporary rut over this, the trout that got away. He wriggled his toes in the water in his shoes and got out a cigarette from his breast pocket. He lit it and tossed the match into the fast water below the logs. A tiny trout rose at the match as it swung around in the fast current. Nick laughed. He would finish the cigarette. I mean, I don't know. This story just really spoke to me. And that aspect of it especially, how even though it was hot and he was hungry, it's not like he had a hotel room. He was in a tent that he had to make, coffee that at first was bitter. Also, I'm not going to comment too much on it because I don't know, but I would really love it if we discussed as a class the significance of mentioning Humphrey, right? Humphrey? Where's his name? Hopkins. I would like to discuss that in class. Okay, moving on, because I really don't want this to be long. Oh my God, Amanda, hurry up. Okay, why he should be included in why he should be included in the literary canon? Well, okay, let me tell you why. Because, first of all, Ernest Hemingway, that name is almost synonymous with American literature. Even just taking his first novel as and The Sun Also Rises. Sorry, I almost said A Raisin in the Sun. That is not correct. The Sun Also Rises. That was it was his first. It was like the novel that put him on the map, and it was so new and different than what everybody else was doing, and it was almost raw in a sense. That it just changed the canon forever. And aside from that, this is my opinion. When a reader can pick up a short story or a novel and read it with understanding and empathy, then that work has a chance to carry into the next generation. And that's what Hemingway did. If you ever are curious, you just read Big Two-Headed River, so there you go. But if you want to kind of test the theory again, read A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. Please read A Farewell to Arms. It is amazing. It's my favorite, arguably my favorite novel of all time, A Farewell to Arms. The Old Man and the Sea. My mom likes to joke that if you ever have trouble sleeping at night, that you should read The Old Man and the Sea and it'll put you to sleep because it's very slow. I disagree. I loved it. The Sun Also Rises is also very good. again, very long, but it's very good. I mean, and that's what it is. I mean, any of these books, any of these short stories, regardless of, you know, cultural circumstance or even the time in which it was written, I mean, that's what makes a good story. And that's what makes an author worth teaching. That's what makes an author that teachers and professors want to teach, because they carry something that lasts generations. So, in the words of Forrest Gump, that is all I have to say about that. Okay, similarities and differences with other authors that we have read. Since I have been yapping, I think for about 30 minutes, I'm just gonna quickly, I compared him to William Faulkner. In Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants and Faulkner's A Rose for Emily, both of them paint a picture of women who, who can't break away from their significant others. Basically, they define themselves according to what their men are thinking and feeling and saying and doing. They have no self-identity at all. And then they're different because Faulkner, they differ in their style. Faulkner had kind of a tendency to ramble sometimes. Not that it was a bad thing. I enjoyed Faulkner, but he had a tendency to ramble in certain areas, kind of, you know, over just describing every little detail, you know, in full. Whereas Ernest Hemingway could pack an entire scene into one sentence, and it didn't feel like the never-ending sentence. And that's my similarity differences comparison. I think that's it, guys. Oh my gosh, did I do it? I think I did it. Oh my gosh. Okay,